Alright. The book goes on to talk about airplanes, which I believe I mentioned, the new kind of warfare. The planes started using machine guns to shoot at each other and made flying dangerous. Women were called on to do more work than they'd been called on to do before. They were expected to drive trucks, operate factory machinery, and I mean, I spent 27 years inside a factory, and I can tell you, a lot of the women at this time began to wear pantsuits because, after all, a lot of factory work is in elevated positions on scaffolds where it had been immodest for them to wear skirts in an elevated position, so a lot of them began wearing pants, and this was to remain true during both world wars. When the war was over, the women were just kicked out of the factories and sent back home. And by 1919, your book mentions that there were a lot of unemployed women. But the role they played influenced countries to give them the right to vote. And European nations, on both sides, wound up giving women the right to vote after the war, including the United States, which the war ended in 1918. And women were given the right to vote for the first time in the 1920 presidential election. Now, I did talk quite a bit about the Bolshevik Revolution. I won't repeat that here. I'll move on to the last year of the war. Essentially, what happened, Germany simply ran out of, you might say, ran out of gas. The British took control of the Arab oil fields thanks to the efforts of Lawrence of Arabia, who persuaded the British sheiks to rebel against the Ottoman Empire. The British got the German oil fields. Now, I had a Ukrainian young man say, there's a lot of oil in the Ukraine. That is true, but it was not under the control of Germany, or it could not outproduce the British. So in effect, even as long ago as 1918, when a side ran out of gas, they pretty well had to surrender. Being out of gas meant their trains couldn't run, their officers couldn't get around, their supply trucks couldn't run, and also their civilian population was starting to starve. The United States entered the war, and initially it looked like the United States troops were not going to be able to handle the situation, but Americans gave a good accounting of themselves, particularly in the Second Battle of the Marne, where the American troops turned the tide of battle. The Germans were advancing, and the French bumped into some Americans and said, hey, turn around, get out of here, they're whipping us. And the American officer said, hey, we're not going to go anywhere, we just got here. And the Americans stood their ground. When the Germans advanced on the American position, the Americans halted the Germans. And again, the Germans found themselves, their armies after a while, in full retreat. One date I want you to remember is the date November 11th, now we still celebrate it. It's called Armistice Day. On November 11th, hopefully you're aware, the post offices close, the banks close, government offices shut down. We're celebrating the victory over Germany in World War I, in what we thought was a war to end all wars. November 11th, was 11, 11, and 11, at the 11th hour. Don't worry about the 11th hour, but on the 11th month, the 11th day of the 11th month, at the 11th hour, the armistice was signed. It ended the war, and your book talks about the extremely high casualties. 8 and 9 million soldiers, another 22 million wounded, and many of those wounded died later. Their lives were greatly shortened. Lived with missing arms or legs or other forms of mutilation. Because so many men were dead, the birth rate in many countries declined noticeably. Again, because of the death and maiming of so many young men. One thing I did not mention, 1/3 of the battle deaths were due to gas warfare, particularly mustard gas. Now, during my basic training, and again, I trained in 1980, and I don't know how they trained now. I was in the Army from 1979 to 1986, but we did a lot of gas warfare training. Today, supposedly our gas mask can handle any gas that was used in World War I, but in those days we did not have the gas masks that we have today. And gas warfare is believed to have killed 1/3 of the men who were killed in the battle, and particularly the mustard gas. Gas warfare was outlawed after World War I and was not used in World War II. The Germans had it, but they held it back. All right. Peace settlements. And for the first time, a sitting president crossed the ocean. Woodrow Wilson sailed across the Atlantic to attend a peace conference in Paris. Your book shows a picture of the big four. The President of France, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, the President of Italy, and the President of the United States. Eventually, the President of Italy left the conference, and it was only the big three, Britain and France, United States. And they got together and tried to make a peace treaty. Now, the treaty that ended the war is the Treaty of Versailles. Treaty of Versailles. Versailles is the same palace that had been built by Louis XIV. That's where the armistice was signed. The Treaty of Versailles was especially harsh on Germany. The Germans resented Article 231, which said that Germany was to take sole blame for starting the war. And this upset, and also they said that Germany was to pay a reparation. Now, folks, this was one of the biggest mistakes the ambassadors made. What they were doing was telling Germany that since you started a war, you must pay the cost. It might sound fair enough, but after World War II now, we showed a lot more sense. We went in and we rebuilt Germany, and we helped rebuild Japan. We rebuilt our enemies, and guess what? They haven't fought us since. But after World War I, now greatly against President Wilson's wishes, President Wilson did not want Germany to have to pay a reparation. He did not want Germany to take the blame for causing the war. But Wilson found out that he was not completely in charge. There was a whole lot of hatred for the Germans and the Austrians, and Wilson could not overcome that. Anyway, now, part of what they intended to do was set up. Oh yeah, by the way, I'm first going to get back to some of the reparations. Supposing I only had $100, and I said I can give each of you $100, how would it work? Well, basically, you start off here, give the first one of $100, who in turn would pass on the side. It's called circulation. That's how a little bit of money can keep a big economy going. You get your paycheck on Friday, by Saturday, most of it's gone. It's called circulation. Take one player out of the game, especially if that player is an industrious nation like Germany is, and all of a sudden the circulation stops. And a bunch of you don't get your $100. As long as the player is circulating, I mean basically, you're getting your $100 for some goods and services you're delivering. So you perform a good service for the next person, you get $100, and he performs a good service for somebody else, gets another 100. You keep the money circulating. But again, take one out of the game, and all of a sudden the $100 is gone. So the reparation did a lot to take Germany out of the game, and it was to lead to the Great Depression, which I must get around to talking about before the end of the chapter. Again, they made some mistakes. Now, one general looked at the treaty and said, "This is not a peace treaty. This is a 20-year truce." Remember that statement so because it proved to be so true. The truce was signed in 1919. In 1939, Europe was at war again. But they intended to make a peace treaty. Among other things, in addition to having to take the blame for the war, Germany was told, you must restrict the size of your army and navy. And Hitler was to break that part of the treaty within a few years. And you must pay the reparation, take the blame, several other things that were really harsh on Germany that was to wind up influencing the Germans to get ready and go back to war a generation later. Now, Article 231, there was the bottom of page 683, the guilt clause, the reparations, all that's right there. Now, there were a lot of other peace treaties signed. A whole bunch of new nations were formed. The Austrian Empire was broken up greatly. Finland, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Poland were new nations. Czechoslovakia were created. Hungary was also created as a separate nation. Austria was greatly reduced in size. So it is today, it's not much bigger than Switzerland, which is next door. And also, Serbia was broken up, no longer a kingdom. Instead, a new nation called Yugoslavia was formed, where the Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes were united under a single king. Then this was to become important later, because Yugoslavia was to exist until 1990, when it also broke up. The Ottoman Empire was also destroyed. Again, a whole lot of new nations. Like I said at the beginning, when I started talking about World War I made more changes to the map of Europe and more changes to European society than did World War II. Even though World War II involved more casualties, World War I, like I say, ended the Ottoman Empire, ended the control of the nobility in Germany and Austria, ended the royal house of Germany, Russia, Austria, and of course the Ottoman Empire. Formed a whole lot of new nations, and ended the several other nations. World War I, your book mentions how it undermined the whole idea of progress, convinced mankind that, hey, we just simply, number one, we must never fight another war, but number two, human morality has not progressed anywhere beyond what it had down through the ages. Anyone else wants to come in? All right. Okay. When the troops went home from World War I, the ones who were able to began to resume their lives where they left off. There was a period of depression right away after World War I, which was quickly over. The depression of the early 1920s is what we call the Forgotten Depression. Why is it forgotten? Because basically we don't remember it. It was short-lived for one thing, but it was actually a very deep, terrible depression. But it ended by itself. Now, folks, here's a point. Somebody wrote a book called The Forgotten Depression. about the Depression of the early 1920s. No, I'm not talking about the Great Depression of 31. I'm talking about the early 1920s. There was a depression, and where was our president? Woodrow Wilson was flat on his back, unable to work. Who was running the presidency? His wife. We don't know how many bills she signed into law, how many generals she gave orders to, how many executive orders she might have issued. The president's illness was kept secret. Basically, here's what happened to President Wilson. He had a few strokes before becoming president. Then he went home. He got up the idea of the League of Nations. I'll get back to the Depression in a minute. And also the League of Nations was where that the nations would be able to get together and talk over the problems without going to war. Several nations joined the League. Problem was, the United States did not join. And the reason the United States did not join was the Constitution says that all treaties that our president makes must be ratified by 2/3 of the Senate. Well, Wilson came home, having only carried Democrats with him, and this was a bad mistake on his part here. He should have carried some Republicans along. I mean, the minority Republicans should have carried along a few Republicans to make it look like it was a bipartisan effort. He only carried Democrats. He came home, and the Republicans said, no, wait, the Senate said, we want to make sure that we approve everything that you do, Mr. President, because we think this is the Constitution. President Wilson, no, I want to be able to act unilaterally without your approval. Wilson was unwilling to compromise. The Senate voted barely, a little bit more than a third voted against it, but they barely voted against it. They voted not to join. President Wilson began to stomp around, trying hard to get the people of the country to informed and tell them, hey, urge your senators to vote for this. And while stomping around the country, he suffered a massive stroke. He was rushed back to Washington and put in his bed there in the White House, and the extent of his illness was kept secret. But during the time he was sick, the country underwent all kinds of strikes, underwent a scare of a communist takeover, underwent a depression. Riots occurred in the streets, and Mr. Wilson was out of it. Yes?
You said wife signed the treaty?
She didn't sign the treaty. No, that she did not do. But the treaty had to be ratified by the Senate. Yeah, she couldn't. The president can't sign. The president can negotiate treaties. That's in the treaty he negotiates must be approved by 2/3 of the Senate. That's still in the Constitution to this day. His wife kept his illness a secret, and since then we've set up the 25th Amendment, which states that if a team of doctors determine the president mentally or physically incapable of acting, the vice president takes over. But the 25th Amendment was not passed until 1966. But in the meantime, like I said, our country had no president, so what about the Great Depression of the 1920s? There are experts who have said that by not having a president insert his interference and keep the depression going, the depression worked through itself and worked its way out and ended without any government intervention. Folk, I hope you all get my point, because when the next depression occurred in 1929, the president did act, and he acted, and he acted, and he acted, and he acted. The depression went on 1929, 1930, 1931, 1932, 1933, if you're getting tired of it, they did too. 1934, 1935, 1936. Now it got really bad in 1937. 1938, 1939. It finally ended abruptly in 1940, when the United States started building arms to help Britain and Russia fight World War II. We were not involved in the war, but we began to build armaments. And all of a sudden, everybody was at work, and the depression was over.